The flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet suburban street as the patrol car screeched to a halt. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in a pressed beige cardigan and clutching her phone tightly, stood on the curb, her arm extended, finger pointing. "There he is!" she exclaimed, her voice sharp and unwavering. Across the street, a young boy, no older than 14, froze in his tracks. He wore a simple gray hoodie and jeans, a backpack slung over one shoulder, its weight tugging him slightly to one side. The officers stepped out of their vehicle, hands hovering near their belts, their voices firm as they called out to the boy. The woman's voice pierced the tense silence. "I told you he looked out of place. I saw him pacing around looking into houses. He doesn't belong here." The boy, wide-eyed and visibly shaken, hesitated, his gaze darting between the officers and the woman accusing him. His lips parted as if to explain, but his words were drowned out by the sound of the police issuing commands. Across the street, curtains were pulled back ever so slightly as neighbors peeked out, their faces partially obscured, but their curiosity undeniable. The boy's hands slowly rose, trembling, as one officer approached, handcuffs in view. Then the sound of tires crunching against the asphalt. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, and out stepped a poised, commanding figure, a woman dressed in an elegant yet understated navy suit. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she approached. Her voice, calm but authoritative, cut through the commotion. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes locked on her son. The officers paused, glancing at each other, unsure of how to respond. And then the woman added, with an air of unmistakable certainty, "You might want to reconsider your approach. That boy is my son." What followed would leave everyone at the scene in stunned silence. Before we get deeper into this story, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments. And if you're ready to uncover the unexpected twist that left everyone speechless, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's about to happen. Jamal Washington was no ordinary teenager. At just 14 years old, he carried himself with a quiet confidence and respect that stood out. As the son of Dr. Angela Washington, the state's governor, Jamal lived a life under the constant spotlight of public scrutiny. Yet, despite his privileged upbringing, he valued humility. Angela had always taught him that no title made them better than anyone else. That afternoon, Jamal had walked to the nearby community library to return books for a school project. He loved history, often immersing himself in stories of resilience and triumph. With his backpack filled with neatly organized notes and a paperback novel, he was on his way home, taking the scenic route through the neighborhood. Karen Simmons, a longtime resident of the area, prided herself on knowing who's who in the community. She liked to think of herself as a neighborhood protector, though her judgments often leaned on her biases. From her window, she watched Jamal walking past, his head tilted slightly downward as he scrolled through his phone. To her, he didn't seem to fit. She couldn't quite place him, but that was enough to raise suspicion in her mind. Karen grabbed her phone, her eyes narrowing. "What's he doing here?" she murmured to herself. Her overconfidence and ingrained prejudice propelled her to act without hesitation. She pressed the 3 familiar digits and made the call, her tone carrying an air of certainty. Meanwhile, Jamal's mom, Dr. Angela Washington, was in her office preparing for a late afternoon meeting. A former civil rights attorney turned governor, Angela was no stranger to dealing with issues of race and justice. Her leadership journey had been one of perseverance, and she instilled those same values in her son. When her phone buzzed with an urgent call from a concerned neighbor, she had no idea that her role as both a mother and a leader would soon be tested. Karen Simmons stood on her front porch, phone pressed to her ear, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "A young man is walking through the neighborhood," she said, her eyes following Jamal as he strolled along the sidewalk. "I've never seen him here before. He's wearing a hoodie and carrying a backpack. I think he might be checking out the houses." Jamal had always insisted on one thing. He didn't want to be treated differently because of who his mom was. As the son of Dr. Angela Washington, the state's governor, he often found himself under the shadow of her influence and stature. But Jamal craved a sense of normalcy. He didn't want people to see him as the governor's son. He tried to walk to school, visit the library, or hang out with friends without the ever-present gaze of security. Reluctantly, Angela had agreed to his request, but not without a compromise. She assigned 2 plainclothes security officers to watch over him from a distance. Stationed in an inconspicuous sedan parked at the corner, the agents kept their eyes on Jamal's every move. Jamal, unaware of their presence, walked freely, believing he was just another teenager going about his day. That afternoon, Jamal had taken a longer route home, enjoying the crisp air and the freedom of solitude. As he scrolled through his phone, he glanced at the street signs, ensuring he was on the right path. His backpack, filled with books and notes, hung loosely over his shoulder. But Karen Simmons didn't see a teenager enjoying a peaceful walk. From her living room window, she watched Jamal with growing suspicion. To her, he didn't belong in the neighborhood. She fixated on the hoodie he wore, the way he glanced at the houses, and the fact that she didn't recognize him. These details, mundane to anyone else, convinced Karen that something was amiss. Her hand reached for her phone, her voice steady as she made the call. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood. He's pacing back and forth, looking into houses," she said, embellishing her observation with each word. From their car, the security agents watched as Jamal continued down the street. "Should we intervene?" one of them asked, his eyes darting between Jamal and the houses around him. "No," the other replied. "We're here to watch, not to disrupt. Unless there's an immediate threat, we stay in position." Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled up alongside Jamal. He stopped, his face a mix of confusion and unease. The officers stepped out, their demeanor serious, and immediately called out to him. "Hey, kid, come here," one officer said, his tone leaving little room for negotiation. Jamal hesitated. "Me?" "Yes, you, now," the officer snapped. Karen stepped out onto her porch, pointing toward Jamal. "That's him," she declared confidently. "He's been hanging around here, looking at the houses. I don't know what he's up to, but it's suspicious." Jamal raised his hands slightly, trying to appear non-threatening. "I'm just walking home," he said softly. "Where do you live?" the officer asked, his gaze scrutinizing Jamal's every move. "Just around the corner," Jamal replied. "Got any ID?" "No, sir," Jamal said, his voice trembling. I don't carry it when I'm walking home." The second officer stepped closer. "What's in the bag?" "Just my books," Jamal replied, unzipping the backpack with shaking hands. The officers rifled through it, finding nothing out of the ordinary. From their car, the security agents exchanged worried glances. "This is escalating," one of them said, already reaching for his phone. "We need to call the governor," the other agreed, his tone grim. As the tense exchange continued, the commotion began to draw attention. Neighbors, curious and concerned, started stepping out of their homes. Some lingered on their porches, arms crossed, observing the scene. Others edged closer, their murmurs adding a growing hum of speculation to the air. "Is that Jamal?" whispered an older woman to her husband. "I've seen him before. He's Angela's boy, isn't he?" But not everyone in the small crowd was as understanding. A man standing near Karen Simmons chimed in, nodding in agreement with her accusations. "If he doesn't live here, what's he doing wandering around? Karen's right to call." Karen, emboldened by the support, raised her voice. "I've lived here for years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. He's up to no good." Jamal's heart pounded as the officers pressed him for answers. "I told you I live around the corner," he repeated, his voice shaking. He turned to the gathering crowd, his eyes pleading for someone to recognize him, to step forward and vouch for him. But the officers seemed unconvinced. "Until we confirm your story, you're staying right here," one of them said, his tone firm. And then a voice broke through the noise. "Excuse me, officers, what's the meaning of this?" All heads turned as Angela Washington approached, her movements deliberate and unyielding. Her gaze swept over the scene. The officers, Karen, the crowd, and finally her son. Jamal exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and anxiety washing over him. The officers straightened instinctively, sensing the authority in Angela's demeanor. "Ma'am, we're handling a situation here," one of them said cautiously. Angela raised a hand, cutting him off. "And what exactly is the situation? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my son is being detained for walking home." The second officer hesitated before responding. "We received a report of suspicious activity. This young man matched the description given by a concerned resident." Angela's eyes narrowed as she turned her attention to Karen. "A concerned resident," she repeated, her voice calm but pointed. "And what exactly made him suspicious?" Karen faltered for the first time, her confidence wavering under Angela's steady gaze. He was walking back and forth, looking around. It just didn't seem right," she stammered. Angela crossed her arms, her expression unwavering. "So walking home is now a crime?" The crowd grew quieter, the weight of Angela's words settling over them. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, while others nodded in quiet agreement. "Ma'am, we're just following up on the call we received," the first officer interjected, attempting to regain control of the situation. Angela stepped closer, her voice firm. "Then I suggest you follow up properly. Did you find anything suspicious in his bag? Did he resist? Did he do anything to warrant this public spectacle?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "No, ma'am," one of them admitted. "Then I'd like to know why you're still questioning him," Angela said, her tone sharp. The tension was palpable as Angela turned to Jamal, her expression softening. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. Jamal nodded, though his hands still trembled slightly. "I didn't do anything, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Angela replied, squeezing his shoulder reassuringly before turning back to the officers. Karen, however, wasn't ready to back down. "I was just looking out for the neighborhood," she said defensively. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Angela faced her, her expression unreadable. "Looking out for the neighborhood? By calling the police on a child who was walking home? You didn't mean for it to go this far, but your assumptions put my son in danger." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint murmurs of the crowd. Angela stepped forward, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even the whispers. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. The officers froze, their expressions shifting as recognition dawned on them. Karen's face went pale, her self-assured demeanor crumbling as the implications of Angela's question began to sink in. The crowd watched, breathless, as the balance of power in the situation began to shift. Angela Washington's question hung in the air like a challenge. The murmuring crowd fell silent, eyes fixed on her. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing they had overlooked something significant. But Karen Simmons, emboldened by years of unchallenged authority in her small world, crossed her arms, still unwilling to back down. "I don't care who you are," Karen said sharply. "This is my neighborhood, and I have every right to call the police if I see something suspicious." Angela stepped closer, her calm demeanor unwavering. "And you think that something suspicious is my son?" she asked, gesturing toward Jamal. Karen faltered, but before she could respond, Angela turned toward the crowd. "To everyone standing here wondering who I am, let me introduce myself," she began, her voice carrying a steady authority. "I am Dr. Angela Washington, the newly elected governor of this state." Gasps rippled through the gathering. Some neighbors stepped back in surprise. Others leaned in, whispering to one another. One man muttered, "I thought Governor Washington was a man." Karen's face drained of color. She blinked as if trying to process the revelation. "You?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Angela replied, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "I am the governor. And for those of you who didn't know, let me clarify why that might be. I wasn't the popular candidate. I didn't have the backing of those who've always controlled the game. And yes, I am a black woman, leading a state where people like me aren't often seen in positions of power." The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, straightened their postures, their earlier confidence replaced with uncertainty. Angela turned to them, her tone measured but firm. "Officers, I understand you were responding to a call, but let me ask you this. At what point did you stop and think about whether this young man, a child, posed any real threat? Did you take the time to evaluate the situation, or did you act on assumptions? Assumptions fueled by someone else's prejudice?" The officers looked down, avoiding her gaze. Then Angela shifted her focus to Karen, her voice calm yet cutting. "And you," she said, "you looked at a boy walking home from the library and decided he didn't belong. You called the police without cause, putting his safety at risk. Do you realize what could have happened here? Do you understand the weight of your actions?" Karen opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, her words failing her. Angela stepped closer to Jamal, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "This is my son," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its strength. "He is a bright, respectful young man who deserves to walk in his neighborhood without fear. And today, you took that sense of safety away from him." The crowd stood in stunned silence, the gravity of Angela's words sinking in. Some neighbors began to nod, their earlier hesitation replaced with quiet agreement. Others looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting between Angela and Karen. Angela turned back to the officers, her voice steady. "This could have ended very differently, and that's why we have to do better, as a society, as individuals, and especially as those entrusted with the responsibility of protecting others." Her final words were met with a heavy silence, the weight of the moment unmistakable. For Karen, for the officers, and the crowd, there was no mistaking the lesson in Angela's powerful, composed presence. Jamal, standing beside his mother, straightened his shoulders. For the first time that day, the fear in his eyes began to fade, replaced with a sense of pride and relief. The weight of Angela Washington's words lingered in the air like an unspoken truth that could no longer be ignored. The officers, clearly shaken, exchanged glances before one of them finally stepped forward. His voice, which had carried an edge of authority earlier, was now subdued and careful. "Governor Washington," he began, clearing his throat, "we apologize for any misunderstanding. We were responding to a call, but it's clear now that there was no wrongdoing here." Angela nodded slightly, her expression unwavering. "Your job is to protect and serve," she said firmly, "but that protection should extend to everyone. Make sure this moment stays with you, and next time, think before you act on someone else's assumptions." The officers nodded their faces, a mixture of embarrassment and acknowledgement. "We'll be leaving now," one of them said quietly, gesturing to his partner. The two returned to their cruiser and drove off without another word, the tension beginning to lift from the scene. Angela then turned her attention to Karen, who still stood on her porch, clutching her cardigan tightly. Her face had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by a mix of regret and discomfort. The neighbors who had gathered were no longer murmuring in agreement with her. Instead, their expressions ranged from disapproval to quiet contemplation. "Karen," Angela began, her tone measured but piercing, "this is your opportunity to reflect. I want you to think long and hard about why you felt the need to act the way you did today. What was it about my son, walking home, carrying books, that made you assume he was a threat? Was it the color of his skin? Was it the fact that he didn't fit your idea of who belongs here?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her gaze dropped to the ground, and she muttered, "I didn't mean for this to happen." "That's the problem," Angela said, her voice cutting through Karen's weak defense. "You didn't think about what could happen. Your biases blinded you, and today they almost cost an innocent boy his safety, his life. You need to do better, for yourself, for this community, and for everyone who deserves to feel safe." Angela let her words hang for a moment, her eyes steady on Karen, before finally stepping back and placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart," Angela said gently, her tone softening as she looked at her son. As they began walking down the street, the crowd parted to let them pass. Some neighbors nodded respectfully, while others looked away, seemingly ashamed. Jamal kept his head high, his steps in sync with his mother's calm, confident stride. When they were far enough from the crowd, Jamal finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Mom," he said, glancing up at her, "thank you. I didn't know you'd come." Angela smiled down at him, her grip on his shoulder tightening slightly. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I'll always be there for you, no matter what." Jamal exhaled, his earlier fear now replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he added after a moment, "for everything." Angela looked ahead, her expression thoughtful. "And I'm proud of you too," she said. "But remember this, Jamal, there's a world out there that won't always treat you fairly. And when that happens, you stand tall, and you let them know who you are." The camera pans out as Angela and Jamal walk into the distance, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the street. The voices of the neighbors fade away, leaving only the quiet hum of the world resuming its normal rhythm. This moment was more than a confrontation. It was a reminder, a lesson about the consequences of assumptions and the quiet power of standing up for what's right. In the face of prejudice and injustice, one voice can make all the difference. Angela's thoughts lingered on what had just unfolded. It wasn't the first time she had encountered this kind of bias, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But this time it was different. It had struck her family directly, reminding her that no position of power, no title, no status could shield them entirely from the weight of prejudice. Later that evening, sitting in her study, Angela reflected on the events of the day. Her voice, calm yet resolute, carried the weight of her thoughts. "This isn't just about my son," she began. "It's about every parent who fears for their child's safety because of how the world sees them. It's about a system that allows assumptions to dictate actions. And it's about a society that still has so much work to do. Even as governor, even in a position of leadership, my family isn't exempt from the realities of racial profiling. It's a painful truth, but it's one we must confront if we're ever going to change it." Angela Washington's story isn't unique. It's a reflection of countless experiences across the country where assumptions and biases shape interactions with profound consequences. Moments like these force us to question ourselves and the systems we uphold. How would you handle a situation like this? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? I want to hear your stories and your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation going, because change begins with understanding. Racial profiling is a reality. Awareness is the first step toward change. Share your thoughts below. Together we can learn, grow, and work toward a better future. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that challenge, inspire, and unite us as a community.